Dean Hellman, Mr. Zuhairi, distinguished guests and colleagues, good evening. I speak for the faculty and staff. I think I'll just start. I speak for the faculty and staff of the CCS, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, in welcoming you to the inaugural American Druze Foundation postdoctoral lecture at Georgetown University. I am especially delighted to have Dean Joel Hellman with us this evening. Dean Hellman recently joined Georgetown University after 15 years of service at the World Bank as Chief Institutional Economist and Director of the Center on Conflict, Security, and Development in Nairobi, Kenya. Everyone here will tell you that Dean Hellman has brought a new, invigorating energy to the School of Foreign Service, and I take this opportunity to thank him for his efforts and for his continued support and encouragement of our program. And please join me in welcoming Dean Joel Hellman.
Well, thank you, and let me invite everyone to their seats. I'm sorry to take you away from the food and the drink, but we do have the program. And let me give you a very, very warm welcome on a very, very chilly evening. It is absolutely wonderful to see such a strong turnout here tonight from the American Druze community for this event. I can see from the level of activity. I must admit, every room I've been to today, in this chilly day, has been very, very cold. And I've been wearing sweaters and jumpers. This room radiates warmth. And I think it radiates warmth because of the good conversations that are clearly going on here. It's probably a reunion of such, because I hear that people have been traveling from so many different places to join us this evening, which is a great testament to the strength of this community, a great testament to the American Druze Foundation, and a great honor for us that you joined us here tonight for this event. I am new to the School of Foreign Service and Georgetown University. I've been here only 6 months. But one of the great pleasures of joining an institution already at the top of its game is, of course, you can take partial credit for it, even though you don't deserve any. And you get to come to events like these and see the strength and depth of the community, of scholarship and of practice that we have been able to create over the years here. And in particular, it is a great joy and testament to our sort of strength for me here to see the work that we have done here at the School of Foreign Service and at Georgetown through the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, our work in the Middle East, and the real leadership role that we have been able to play on looking at all aspects, cultural, historical, economic, geographic, political, of the region and the peoples of the region. And I think one of the strengths of the program is, first, its history, given that we are one of the oldest and strongest programs in the region, but also the depth and breadth of our program. And I think one of the reasons we have been able to have such a strong depth and breadth of the support of institutions like the American Druze Foundation and others that have given us the ability and the strength to reach out, look across the region to the people, the communities that have made it so strong and important, and look at the influence of that community and those communities across the globe. That's why I am so pleased to thank the American Druze Foundation for their participation and support, for your participation and support tonight. I'm particularly pleased to thank you for establishing a postdoctoral fellowship in the name of the American Druze Foundation, and that you will have an opportunity to hear from our first ADF recipient, postdoctoral recipient today, Alex Henley. The real sort of strength of our community also lies in our ability to bring the best scholars and the best students to work with us in this community. And fellowship support is really absolutely essential in doing that. And we rely so much on organizations like ADF to help us build that foundation, build that financial support that allows us to bring in scholars and students of the depth and the strength that you will obviously hear today from Alex Henley. So we're especially grateful to have you here. We're especially grateful for your financial support. I want to thank in particular some individuals for helping to make this happen. I'd like to thank Chairman Manal Saab and Mr. Ghassan Saab. Thank you very much. And I'm also very, very pleased to thank the current ADF chair, who just had a lovely opportunity to meet and chat, Mr. Fadeh Zohari. Thank you so much, representing all members of the Druze Foundation here. And I want to thank you as well for this absolutely lovely and fascinating book, which I'm really looking forward to digging into on the Druze in America. Looks like a really interesting and a very impressive book of photos of analysis of what that community has done in this country. I also want to say a little bit about the ADF Postdoctoral Fellowship, the fund itself. It promotes academic research on Arab societies generally, but on the Druze communities in particular, and it helps us and aims to advance the production of a specialized knowledge about Druze communities in the disciplines I mentioned before, across all disciplines, which is our strength, and which Georgetown University particularly values. So we're grateful for the support of the ADF board. We're grateful for the support of our educational mission. And last but not least, I'll sort of say one thing about our school and why this is so important to our school. This is, many of you may not know, this is the oldest school of international affairs in the United States. We were founded in 1919, just after World War I. In fact, very, very soon after the armistice was agreed. And the founding document of the school was entitled the Peace Bulletin, because it was a way for the Jesuits, who were the founders and leaders of this school, to think about how can we contribute to building a stable peace after the horrors and violence of World War I. How do we create a school that can actually build a foundation for peace in the 20th century? It's a wonderful honor for us to be at a school that had such a noble foundation to build peace after such a difficult war. And the idea, the thought behind the creation of the school was very much, we are going to build peace through understanding, and we're going to build peace by building the depth of knowledge of different communities, different regions of the world, different languages, and introduce them to the United States, which at the time in 1919 was still a very isolationist country, where people didn't travel, people didn't know about the depth and range and excitement of other cultures, languages around the world. This was meant to be a window to those communities, cultures, and histories, not only for the students of Georgetown University, but because we were here in Washington, meant to be a window to the world for all of Washington. That was our mission in 1919, and that really remains our mission today. And that's why this contribution from ADF, this contribution for helping us understand the Druze communities as part of our overall attempt and understanding of the Middle East and the variety and richness of communities there is so important to us. So thank you for contributing to that mission. Thank you for helping us continue to complete and enhance the mission that we were created for in 1919. And I really am pleased that you were able to come here today to help us celebrate that mission. Let me now turn over the chair to the chair of ADF, and yet again welcome you. You know, of course, I assume already, you know that Fadeh Zohari is the director of strategic technologies at the Intel Corporation, where he's had a career that spans impressively 25 years in all aspects, currently responsible for strategic planning and marketing for a whole range of key software and other technologies. I know that he's been serving as the chairman of the American Druze Society, national president from 2001 to 2003, and has been a member of the ADF board of trustees since 2006, and elected as ADF chairman in 2016. So we're pleased to welcome you. We're pleased to welcome the whole community that's assembled here tonight, and I wish you a successful and enjoyable evening. I wish I could join you for the lecture because it sounds like it's going to be a very interesting one. I have to apologize myself because our university board is here today. And as a result, those are the masters, those are the ones who hired me, and those are the ones to whom I report. And I'm going to go straight after this to do that, to report back to them on what's happening in the school. But I do wish you a successful evening and an interesting talk, and welcome you here to Georgetown and the School of Foreign Service. Thanks so much.
Thanks again, and I just want to echo, thank you, Dean, I know you have to go, so I appreciate that. So I want to echo Dean Hellman's comment. It's a very proud moment. I mean, actually we're watching history in the making here. On behalf of the American Druze Foundation, our Druze Foundation mission is to advance the knowledge of the Druze faith and preserve the rich Druze culture and heritage. And this is one of the proudest initiatives we embarked on, and truly we're watching history in the making. This is the moment today, but that moment was shaped by strong vision, dedicated leadership, generosity, and ultimate professionalism by many people. That moment would have not been possible without the strong vision and the leadership of the past chair and Mrs. Manal Saab and her wonderful husband, Mr. Ghassan Saab. Truly, I was honored to be on that board and witnessing that firsthand. They took it by the helm. They rallied their families and their friends. The energy was contagious. Without them, we would not be here today. Not only them, of course, our generous donors, which many of them are here today from overseas. Thank you, Mr. Jamal Jawhari, for coming from all Saudi Arabia, Mrs. Wafwa Saab, the president of AUB alumni, coming from Lebanon, Mr. Faisal Khalil and his lovely daughter and family coming from Lebanon as well, and many other donors from all over the States. And give me a special honor to have Mrs. Lucky Roosevelt with us here today. Truly, thank you so much, Lucky. She's one of our own, and she's a legend in DC and in the US. Thank you so much. You honor us with your presence. I hope there are so many people, I don't want to list all their names, but just I want to tell you that I'm very proud to be part of that history and look forward to much stronger initiative in the future to advance our mission and preserve our Druze heritage and culture. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. So I thanked the key people, but one important person I want to especially Georgetown staff has been wonderful. But one important person who made that happen behind the scene is Dr. Usama bin Murshid. Without his guidance and his professionalism for making this, he's been a great partner. Thank you, Usama. Look forward to a strong relationship in the future and many more initiatives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fadi, for these very generous comments, and also for your leadership and your enterprise in cementing our mutual agreement. As you heard from Dean Hellman, the ADF Endowed Research Fund was established at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in September 2013 with the aim to promote social scientific research on Druze communities and on political and cultural pluralism in the Arab world. The fund is quite unique in its academic focus, and it epitomizes the Foundation's philanthropic work to promote mutual understanding and appreciation across cultural communities and to enrich our knowledge of the universal heritage of the Druze. So I'm very grateful to the trustees of the ADF board for their friendship and for the trust that they have placed in the CCAS. I also look forward to our growing public engagement with them through the ADF Endowed Research Fund in the years to come. And I would also be remiss if I did not acknowledge the hard work and support of Mr. Richard Jacobs, Senior Director of Advancement. Richard was simply critical to the success of our initiative and he has been and remains a strong ally and friend of our center. And many of our success today is due to his dedication to the ADF initiative. Thank you. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexander Henley, the 2015-2016 ADF postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Alex completed his PhD at the University of Manchester and holds degrees in theology and Middle Eastern studies from the University of Durham. His doctoral dissertation explored the construction of a religious elite in modern Lebanon and compared the roles of the Sunni mufti and the Maronite patriarch in contesting sectarian identity production during the Civil War of 1975 to 1990. His research has been supported by grants from the UK Centre for the Advanced Study of the Arab World and the Council for British Research on the Levant, with affiliations at the American University of Beirut and Notre Dame University in Lebanon. As the 2015-2016 postdoctoral fellow, Alex is conducting research on Druze communal institutions in Lebanon and finalizing his manuscript, Religion and State in Lebanon, Religious Leadership, Sectarianism, and Civil War. Tonight's lecture is in fact driven by this research and is entitled Becoming Lebanese, Institutionalizing Druzeness, How Sects Built New Religious Leaderships for Modern Lebanon. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the ADF community, I thank you for attending our inaugural lecture, and I ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Alex Henley.
Good evening. Sorry. My instinct is to thank you for being here, but of course it's because of many of you that I am here, so thank you for that. Let me launch right in. As Osama kindly said, my research is on religious institutions in Lebanon, and I'm going to talk this evening about the Druze religious leadership in Lebanon and give kind of an overview of its history over the last few centuries and try and fit it into a broader framework for you as well. And I know we have quite a mixed crowd in terms of background knowledge on the subject, but anyone who knows anything about Lebanon, of course, knows that the modern state was built around religious communities. And these religious communities are the pillars of its society, we might say. Those more familiar with Lebanon, as again I think many in this room are, will know that each community is represented by its religious leader. And here we have the main four. These figures play a prominent role in public life. They are legally recognized by the state, and they occupy a place in national and international protocol that's roughly equivalent to the heads of states very often. Now, for this evening, we're interested in the official religious leadership of the Druze community in particular, known by the traditional Druze title of Sheikh al-Aql. This is the current incumbent on the far left, Sheikh Naim Hassan. He is based at the imposing community headquarters in Beirut that you may know. This is just an architect's sketch. It's known as Dar al-Ta'ifa al-Durziya. And this is the institution that I'm going to focus on for the next half hour or so. Now, since I'm going to focus more or less exclusively on bearded men of a certain age, I thought I might start with a few quotes from a young woman of the Druze community in Lebanon, who I think in her comments represents many of her peers. Talking about Dar al-Ta'ifa as a whole, she says, firstly, it upholds the image of Druze identity in Lebanon, but she adds somewhat more negatively to this image. She calls it a space fixed in time and a site of seclusion and introversion. And she, I think, is expressing a common view of Lebanese religious leaderships in general, not just the Druze one, as relics of a bygone era, and today as part of the problem of sectarianism in Lebanon. Rola El-Husseini, you might know her recent book on Lebanon, put this in general terms. She says, the clergy have always played a role in Lebanese public life because of the nature of allegiance in Lebanon, that commitment to the nation-state comes after loyalty to the family and the personal representative of one's interests, I guess a zaim, and the clerical leader of one's sect. Thus, the various religious leaders both represent and also perpetuate this kind of zero-sum competition as portrayed in this cartoon. I think that was from a paper in 1975. So they're seen as a core part of this kind of sectarian competition in Lebanon. And we find this image going all the way back through Lebanon's history to its creation in 1920. You may also know this image quite well. Religious leaders were part of this founding moment of the Lebanese state. This is a photo of the official declaration of the state of Lebanon at the French High Commission in Beirut. And looking more closely, you might be able to make out, in the middle you have the French High Commissioner, on one side the Maronite patriarch of the time, and on his other the Sunni mufti. And in this image, of course, we have this French general representing Lebanon as a meeting of two communities. The patriarch is representing all Christians and the mufti is representing all Muslims. But how accurate is this image of confessional blocks? According to this idea, kept in stasis for 100 years, more or less as they were at this time. And also, of course, where is the Druze Sheikh al-Aql in this picture? Nowhere to be seen. I'm going to suggest that this image depicted a reality that wasn't real. It depicted an idea of the time. Rather, the proclamation ceremony represents a... I'm sorry, yes. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Closer to the microphone? Yes, like that. Perhaps that's better. I'll try to speak more clearly. Is that better? So this makes me wonder whether this image is really a true depiction of this time at all. And here I have a quotation from a report written by the French High Commission in Beirut at roughly the same time, saying each community is a little people jealous of its personality, which has its chief, national and religious, at the same time. And the assumption is that local society was defined by religion, and common sense told them that religions have religious leaders. But that isn't always true. The Mufti of Beirut, this character, Mufti Mustafa Najjar, who is the same Mufti in the previous picture, he was certainly not a leader of a community, let alone of all Muslims. In fact, he was a legal expert who, the day before this event, would have been sitting at his stall in the souk in Beirut, distributing fatwas to those who come to ask for them. This is hardly the image of a grand religious leader. And one reason we don't see the Druze Sheikh al-Aql in the photo is that the Druze also did not have a religious leader in 1920. So the question is, why not? A common explanation is that Druze religious leadership was divided between two camps. In 1920, there were two holders of the title of Sheikh al-Aql, each affiliated with a political power center in the community. the Yazbekis and the Jumblatis. According to this explanation, one of the community's great achievements of the past century has been to rescue this top religious office from its divided and weakened state, and to restore it, therefore, to its former glory. And here is a timeline on which you can see the divisions. The initial Jumblati-Yazbeki split, including a couple of decades with 3 title holders in the 50s and 60s. But a general agreement emerged that the community should be united under one religious leader, which was achieved in 1970, with some later setbacks and rough patches that I haven't shown on here. But moving along this timeline, the schism is conventionally dated back to 1825, when political interference supposedly resulted in a breakup of this legitimate religious leadership. Thus, the Sheikh al-Aql today is often supposed to be the last in a line going all the way back to the founding imam of the community in the 11th century, and therefore to the succession of Fatimid caliphs before him. Now, I'm going to look back over this history and tell a slightly different story. Over the centuries following the disappearance of the founder, al-Hakim bi-Amrillah, we find 2 unifying figures who seem to fit the bill of successors to a religious leadership based in Mount Lebanon. And I'm sure, again, you know these names. First, Al-Amir Sayyid Abdullah in the 15th century, and then, of course, Sheikh al-Fadil in the 17th century. But neither of them in their writings reference the term Sheikh al-Aql, nor do they have a notion of a singular religious authority. Instead, they appear to have seen themselves as unifying the community solely through their reforming mission, not by virtue of succession to a supreme position. The immediate disciples of Sayyid Abdullah did form a kind of religious elite for a while, but they did so as a group, not in a succession. The title Sheikh al-Aql first appears, as far as we can tell from surviving documents, around the 17th century. But it didn't have the meaning we give it today. It was primarily just used to clarify the term sheikh, being an ambiguous word which could also be used as a hereditary aristocratic title. And the word aql, meaning something on the lines of wisdom, I guess, is maybe a rough translation, is also a reference, of course, to divine revelation in the Tawhidi cosmology. So Sheikh al-Aql, at first, simply differentiated a man of religion from Sheikh Nasab, the heir of a noble family. It was this very generic term. But the term gradually came to express another distinction, one of seniority. There wasn't any systematic method of granting this title, no elections or formal appointments, but Sheikh al-Aql was used as a title, that is, by consensus to describe the senior religious sheikh of a given locality. As such, it was used more or less interchangeably with other honorifics, Sheikh al-Aql, Sheikh al-Mashayikh, Sheikh al-Asr, Sheikh al-Jalil, these kinds of titles. One text from the 17th century numbers these more senior men of religion at perhaps around 30 men. So we have a kind of a large core of senior religious leaders who might use this title amongst others. What did these men do? Well, their main task, of course, was to give religious guidance, irshad. This included the classic Islamic formulations of commanding good, forbidding evil, as well as prescribing what is halal and haram, permitted or forbidden. But they also had a secondary practical responsibility for the land and buildings used for religious rituals, endowed properties known, of course, as al-Aql. This secondary function was to become more significant as government evolved in Mount Lebanon, and I'll talk about it a little more. Going back to our timeline, we're still in the 17th century. moving now to the 18th century, we see the emergence of the first more or less unified religious leadership. But note that this is only in Mount Lebanon, of course, and didn't extend to the Druze populations further south or east in what are now Syria or Israel. Among the sheikhs of the mountain, it became customary to recognize one as preeminent. This man would be known by the title of Sheikh al-Aql. Yet this title was not exclusively his, as you can see in this image. It was also used for the second tier of distinguished sheikhs, usually in this period, one from each of the 4 regions of Mount Lebanon. And it's difficult to be certain quite why this system, this informal but increasingly evident loose hierarchy, emerged in the 18th century. Why in the 18th century and not at any other time? There's nothing to suggest that understandings of Druze religious authority were changing. Now, if we recall the 2 common responsibilities of Druze sheikhs that I mentioned a moment ago, these are still both operative in the 18th century. The sheikhs al-Aql performed their duty of spiritual guidance, just like any other sheikhs, through their direct relationships with believers in villages and regions. So let's focus on the second one. The second task invites the interest, by its very nature, of outside authorities, as Awqaf holdings entail questions of property rights, income, taxation, that kind of thing. So as Ottoman government increasingly penetrated the mountain, this probably drove a parallel centralization among the Druze sheikhs as a framework for coordinating the management of Awqaf, and also their legal recognition and dispute resolution in these kinds of matters. So now, with a little more background under our belts, we can return to this game-changing event in 1825. Emir Bashir Shahab II, ruling over the Ottoman Emirate of Mount Lebanon, created effectively the modern office of Sheikh al-Aql. Following a Druze insurrection led by Bashir Jumblat and Mukhtara, the emir cracked down on the Druze community. He imposed widespread administrative reforms, one of which was to strip the existing Sheikhs al-Aql of their authority over Awqaf. So he separated these 2 roles that we talked about. And it's not clear whether this was done as a punitive measure. Certainly some of the Mashayikh al-Aql at that time were involved in the Mukhtara rebellion. So it could have been a punishment against this body of sheikhs. Or perhaps it was simply an effort to rationalize the system, to create a more ordered procedure as the emir saw it. In any case, he appointed 2 new officials to take charge of religious awqaf, and he named them Sheikh al-Aql. These 2 were not the only ones using that title at the time. Those who previously used it continued to for a while. But the newly specialized sense in which it was being used now as officers in charge of awqaf, and the official recognition that this vocabulary had, meant that the previous usage naturally died out, probably over the course of a generation or so. And so it turns out that Emir Bashir did not simply manufacture a schism in order to weaken the Druze community. And it wasn't, after all, as we're often told about this history, a case of a cynical ruler setting up 2 rival contenders for the position of religious leader. The double office, instead, seems just to have been a matter of convenience, assigning one to each of the 2 camps. And these 2 clans, of course, were the primary means through which the emir performed local government in the mountain. So essentially he was assigning an Awqaf officer to each clan. So who were these 2 new Sheikhs al-Aql? First of all, they didn't have established reputations as religious authorities. Instead, they seem to have been less prestigious sheikhs at that time, chosen primarily for their family connections to either the Yazbeki or Jumblati clans. Succession to these offices was determined by the clan leadership, not by al-Aql or Sheikhs, and it was determined much like any other position in local administration. This allowed particular families to use their connections, of course, to dominate the office for generations. As you see, the families of Hamade and Talir each held a mashayikha for about 100 years. Moving further into the 19th century, the Ottoman organization of Mount Lebanon into a Christian-run mutasarrafiyya in 1861 brought further reforms aimed at Druze communal autonomy. The functions of the two Sheikhs al-Aql were now set within a more corporate framework, comprising primarily a 3-member administrative body along with the judge of the community, over whom they presided as a final court of appeal. Their mandate over al-Qaf was also expanded to include not only the conventionally religious endowments that sheikhs had always managed, majalis, khalawat, but also a gamut of other charitable al-Qaf run privately by Druze families. This might seem like I'm giving a rather dry account of bureaucratic detail from the 19th century, but the very bureaucratic nature of these changes is its very significance. The idea of the Sheikh al-Aql was first divorced from the hierarchy of religious authority in 1825. Then in its new incarnation, it was set at the top of another budding hierarchy, a different kind of hierarchy, this time a bureaucratic one, made up essentially of sheikhly public servants, you could say. And the job required knowledge of Druze tradition and customs, but it didn't require the conventional conditions of spiritual authority. And meanwhile, of course, other sheikhs among the al-Aql at large continued their own informal system of seniority in the realm of spiritual authority, but no longer used the term Sheikh al-Aql to describe that spiritual authority. And so we arrive back in 1920 at the proclamation of the Lebanese state. And it's more obvious now why there was no Sheikh al-Aql on the podium at the proclamation ceremony. Not only, of course, were there 2 Sheikhs al-Aql at the time, the whole question of Druze religious leadership was muddied by a sheikhly division of labor between spiritual authorities with no titles and bureaucratic functionaries with titles. Lebanon's brand new multi-confessional system created a demand for a clear-cut religious leadership that essentially didn't exist in the Druze community at that time. The Lebanese constitution in the 20s, and what we're looking at here now is actually a draft by Michel Sheikh. The constitution enshrined the notion of a Lebanon made up of semi-autonomous sects. Article 9 reads, "The state, in rendering homage to God Almighty, shall respect all religions." Now, Sheikh's various drafts all stop there, making only a very general affirmation of religious freedom, with the caveat that it must not interfere with public order. But the final text of the Constitution adds this second part, detailing what respect for religion means in practice. It, the state that is, shall guarantee the personal status and religious interests of the population. Now, this second clause was clearly controversial even at the time of writing. Sheikh didn't like it very much, and it remains controversial today, of course. Whereas freedom of religion ranked among the kind of progressive values that a modernizer like Sheikh envisaged in a 20th century constitution, he likely saw the addition of these references to personal status and religious interests as retrograde, serving and preserving, I would say, an ancient social system based on a mosaic of self-governing sects. But I'm not sure that anyone could have predicted the seismic shifts that this clause would actually bring about in Lebanon's religious landscape. In institutional terms, mountains were brought low and others were raised up. This is because, on one hand, personal status needed to be administered by someone, and on the other hand, the protection of religious interests required someone to represent them to the state. So let's look at how this happened in the Druze case and who that someone was. A series of laws from 1960 to 2006 have served effectively as constitutions for the Druze community as a sovereign entity and for its administration. And here we have the Yazbeki and Jumrati sheikhs holding joint responsibility for this administration. The laws define their jurisdiction, like they do the jurisdictions of all other Lebanese communities, as covering religious affairs, ash-shu'un ad-diniyya. And this was effectively a new catch-all concept that considerably expanded the scope of the Sheikh al-Aql's power. Let's start with two domains that were theoretically just carryovers from the 19th century. We've already talked about them, the awqaf and law. The Mutasarrifiyya had already put the Sheikhs al-Aql in charge of both of these aspects, but like so much of governance under the Ottoman Empire, that had been interpreted primarily as kind of a troubleshooting function, offering a recourse of last resort for solving conflicts. Modern ideas about governance were far more interventionist. Supervision was now supposed to be an active process, you could say, demanding clear chains of command, rationalized procedures, centralized decision-making, and, of course, lots of paperwork. The al-Aql are a great example of just how difficult that was to achieve in practice. They include well over 1,000 properties scattered across half of Lebanon, ranging in size from as little as 1 square meter to tens of thousands of square meters. So imagine trying to locate, measure, document, and then finally supervise all of those properties. Now imagine doing that in the face of resistance from local sheikhs and local families, people who had run their local al-Aql for generations, felt a right to them, and in many cases had documented legal rights to them from previous regimes. And so you'll understand why it's taken until only the current decade to get even close to meeting this target of cataloguing all these al-Aql in Lebanon. Some of you might be aware, right now in Beirut, and over previous years, there's been a fierce controversy over the Waqf property in central Beirut. And it's by far, of course, the most valuable Waqf property at about 36,000 square meters, I think, right in the heart of town, extremely valuable land. And the families in charge of it have resisted this centralization process by all means possible. And they have documents to prove their original right to manage the property. Dar al-Ta'ifa has been trying to secure a contract for a huge new ABC mall on that land. And it's worth a lot of money, as you might imagine. But the local management association have blocked this contract up till now. And I think it's been something like 5 years, maybe. And just this one case, still unresolved after decades, gives us an idea of the stakes in this process of centralization, even though the process has generally been very, very gradual and very piecemeal. Let's turn to personal status, the next on our list. There had, of course, been Druze judges in the 19th century. I mentioned one earlier. But they continued to apply a combination of Ottoman, which was Hanafi law, and an assortment of unwritten Druze customary principles. The 1940s saw the first codification of Druze personal status laws, personal status being al-Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya, which was taken by its writers as an opportunity not simply to preserve Druze custom, but to enact widespread reforms. These laws drew not only on the scant references in Druze scriptures to legal issues, but also a combination of both Sunni and Shiite Sharia and the modern legal codes of both Egypt and France, a whole mix of sources. One legal scholar here describes the finished product as the most impressive modern family law so far enacted in any Middle Eastern Arab state, embodying far-reaching reforms, he says. Another significant impact of this new legal system was that it weakened the authority of local sheikhs, who had often arbitrated matrimonial issues in their own villages. Druze judges were now required to possess legal degrees, recognized degrees, and were appointed by the Sheikh al-Aql. So, we have two further spheres of influence added to this list. All Druze charitable associations and schools now had to report to the Sheikh al-Aql. Some entrepreneurial incumbents of the office have taken this remit even further, getting involved in building their own charities and schools for the community. Here we see Sheikh Mohammed Abu Shakra laying the cornerstone of the new hospital at Ain Wazain. And here you have the completed hospital in it's a magazine ad on the right. And these kinds of projects, and there were many others, Sheikh Mohammed in particular was a great builder of these kinds of institutions. These kinds of projects helped raise the prestige of the Sheikh's office, as well as his ability to distribute patronage to a certain extent. But nothing did more for the image of the Sheikh al-Aql, of course, than the building of Dar al-Ta'ifa itself in the 1950s. And we can see a real photo of the building. As you can see from this picture, it became effectively the monolithic public face of the community in Lebanon. It also, of course, was built to house the growing bureaucracy that exercised the various powers that were now being brought quite literally under one roof. And having built the physical architecture of the institution, a further step was taken in 1962 to modernize the organizational architecture to match. A principle of collegial authority was introduced with the creation of the Druze Confessional Council, al-Majlis al-Madhabi. The council functions as a combination of parliament and cabinet, effectively, part elected, part appointed, wielding both legislative and executive powers. And the Sheikh al-Aql is the president of the council. In the somewhat distant middle of this picture, you can see Sheikh Mohammed again presiding over the very first meeting of this sizable council in 62. And this new setup increased buy-in from the community, effectively, got them involved in this new institution, boosted the authoritative voice of the Sheikh al-Aql in particular, gave him more legitimacy as a representative of the community. Having said that, of course, as you might also be aware, it's become the easiest way for political leaders to try to influence this institution. But that's another story, I think. It's also interesting to note that the new collegial organization was supposed to be accompanied, if we look back at this, was supposed to be accompanied by a democratic basis of election. The law of 1962 mandated general election of the Sheikh al-Aql by all Druze men eligible to vote in national elections. And I think there was an element of what you could call confessional one-upmanship between communities in the race in the 1950s and 60s to modernize their institutions fastest and further than anyone else. The other communities all had a combination of a religious leader and a council. And so the Druze got themselves a council to match their religious leader. The other religious leaders were also all elected in some way, but all by closed electoral colleges. So the community saw an opportunity to outdo the others, I think, and democratize their leadership much more comprehensively. Now, you may not have heard of this principle of democratic election of Sheikh al-Aql, and that's because it never actually happened, unfortunately. One way or another, the next election that was held since that law was put in place in 1962 was not until 2006, by which point the electoral law had been changed, limiting the vote to a college, just like the other communities have. Now, if we look back at our timeline, you can see that when the Druze Council was created in 1962, there were 3 holders of the title of Sheikh al-Aql. And as you might imagine, this caused total chaos in an institution that was being built now as a single monolith. The modern body of a centralized bureaucracy just didn't have space on its shoulders for multiple heads. A general agreement emerged in the community that it would be better to have a single religious leader to match the figureheads of the other Lebanese communities. When 2 of the 3 sheikhs died in 1970, the last man standing was left to himself to consolidate the institution around him. And that man, of course, was Sheikh Mohammed Abu Sha'ra. And he was the Sheikh al-Aql who could finally step fully into the limelight of Lebanese public life as the sole official representative of his sect. Having conformed to this Lebanese model of a religious leader, it was now clear to the state elite that he was the proper object of their respect for the Druze religion. And if that sounds a funny thing to say, I'm referring here, of course, to Article 9 of the Constitution that we looked at, that said the state shall respect all religions. And the way that is performed publicly in the protocols of Lebanese public life is by paying respects to the religious leader. As leader of the Druze community in particular, he was entitled to a place not just among the Lebanese religious leadership in general, but especially among the top 4. Here we have the 3 top Muslim leaders, and to that you could add the Maronite patriarch, like that earlier image we saw right at the beginning. You often see these 3 or 4 pictured together. And in Lebanon, of course, as we know, all sects are equal, but some are more equal than others. So, as representative of the distinguished Druze community in the Lebanese context, he gets this special place on the podium now, where he didn't in 1920. Images like this have come to represent, I guess, unity and diversity in Lebanon. Diversity so long as it's the officially sanctioned diversity of the confessional system. A couple more pictures of Abu Sha'ra. This is less clear, I'm afraid. But as an official religious leader, the Sheikh al-Aql is not just a symbol to be paraded in public. He has tremendous access and is consulted by politicians, diplomats, heads of state. King Faisal, if you can make him out on the right as an elderly man. And in this picture, we have a younger Hafiz al-Assad. So it becomes routine at this stage for Sheikh al-Aql to be consorting with heads of state, with the triple presidency of Lebanon. And I want to bring this story to a conclusion by putting it into a broader perspective. I think if we could chart the developing power of the Sheikh al-Aql through the 20th century on a nice, neat graph like this, and it's something that this is slightly made up, but as a way to kind of represent in 2 dimensions some of what I'm talking about, it might look a bit like this. The institution existed previously, of course, in a very modest form, as I've described, but it underwent huge transformations, especially in the 40s through to 70s, becoming what it is today. Now, if I start adding the religious leaderships of other sects to this graph, you'll soon see the point of this exercise. The Maronite Patriarchate takes an almost opposite course, having been at its height in 1920, and I say at its height because it had risen from its former position through to various revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. It wasn't always the institution that it was at the time of the proclamation of Lebanon, when the Patriarch appears by the French general's side. So it takes this opposite course, having been at its height, then gradually in decline through most of the 20th century, but this proved, to some people's surprise, not to be a terminal decline, but more of a, I'd say perhaps a cutting to size of this patriarchate, so that it could fit into this multi-confessional society. The office of mufti in the Sunni community already existed in the form of the mufti of Beirut, and we saw him earlier as well, but it was quickly converted into the new office of the Grand Mufti of the Republic, Mufti al-Jumhuriyya, and this happens quite rapidly. And I think this office of the Mufti is, to some extent, a model on which the Druze community bases its idea of what religious leadership ought to look like. Finally, the Shi'i community set up a council and leadership more or less from nothing in the 1960s, an initiative, of course, led by the famous Imam Musa al-Sadr. And the point of all this is to show finally the convergence of these trajectories. Each of Lebanon's official religious leaders certainly, of course, has its own colour. It has its own distinctive traditional character. But they are also products of a distinctively Lebanese kind of meeting in the middle. And do you still remember, right at the beginning, I brought up those quotes from a young Druze woman? I'll bring them up again. She described Dar al-Ta'ifa as a site of seclusion and introversion, and a space fixed in time. These impressions echo what we're often told, not just about Sheikh al-Aql or Dar al-Ta'ifa, but actually about the whole Druze community. And the idea is essentially that it seems this closed, unchanging community. And the useful thing I think about looking at this history of Sheikh al-Aql over the centuries is that it shows us a different side of the community. It shows us a side of the Druze community that has always been dynamic and progressive and has constantly engaged with its neighbors and its context. And I'll leave you with this, with my favorite picture of a Sheikh al-Aql. Of course, this is the late Hariri being sternly told off. Thank you very much.
All right, I want to thank Alex for a thoroughly stimulating and engaging lecture, and for giving us such a brilliant example of how the ADF Research Fund is already underwriting very necessary work on the Druze community. So you do have, it is a historic moment, and you do have every reason to be proud, and I congratulate the ADF community and the larger Druze community. So I will now moderate the Q&A session, and I will ask you to raise your hand, and I will call on you. We've got a couple of microphones, and I will try do my best to see you, even though I'm blinded by the lights. But I already saw a hand here from Mr. Abu Shakra and a hand over there from Rabia. So can we start at the front row and then go to Rabia in the back, please? Why don't you sit here?
Thank you. I would like your opinion about a very interesting explanation of what Sheikh al-Aql means. I thought it was Sheikh of wisdom, as you mentioned. But my late uncle, Sheikh Muhammad Abu Shakra, told me that it didn't mean that at all, and it had no connection to wisdom. What it meant was al-Aql, which means in Arabic, al-Rabt, holding back people from haram. So he is the leader who makes the Druze, he holds them back from committing sin or haram. What do you think of that?
That's fascinating. I've heard this explanation as well, and it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's part of its power as a title. I think is that you can kind of interpret it in these various ways, and including, of course, as Sheikh al-Aql in the sense of Sheikh al-Aql. And it kind of has these various implications to it, but that's very interesting. Thank you.
Al-Aql means something else. Al-Aql means something else, differentiating them from al-Juhal, who are not really practicing their religion. Okay? But here, Aql is Rabt. The rope that ties a camel is Aql.
I think you've just
Thank
added
you.
a chapter to Alex's.
Absolutely. We'll have to
Thank
talk.
you.
We'll have to talk more, I hope. Thank you.
Rabia, please. In the
Thank you. This was very interesting and fascinating and educational. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you had a chance to compare or examine the difference in authority between the official representative of the Druze as a state leader, such as Sheikh Muhammad Abu Shakra, versus the spiritual leader of the community, who's regarded more as the guiding leader, such as the late Sheikh Abu Hassan Arif. I wonder if you had a chance to compare these two and understand how the society or the community responds to their power and authority. Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and it's the yes, it's the other side to this story, right? It's when I kind of tried to describe, I think what you have is this splitting of ways. I think I said a division of labor, effectively between the old style spiritual authority, the traditional things that sheikhs do, and then these new sheikhs al-Aql who become functionaries. And so, of course, actually it's a fascinating thing about the Druze community, is that this differentiation has been maintained up till now. As you say, you have these figures like Sheikh Arif al-Halawi, who can legitimately be seen as the leading spiritual authority in the community, far above, of course, any of the esteemed Sheikhs al-Aql we have had. And the two perform such different functions. But I would say it's something that marks the Druze community apart, because when this process has happened in other communities, like the Sunni community, for instance, this process of bureaucratization and centralization included all of the ulama. It included everyone. If you work in a mosque as an imam, a khatib, you have to be licensed by Dar al-Fatwa in Beirut. You have to, by the mufti. And so the Sunni community created an astoundingly pervasive hierarchy that was built essentially as a kind of a sub-branch of government. And so nothing was immune in the Sunni community to this transformation, whereas in the Druze community, actually, you have a preservation of quite a different kind of religious life, I think, amongst the sheikhs of the mountain. Yes, perhaps we should move on to the next question. Thank you for that.
Please go ahead.
In your last slide depicting the different...
We're getting
In one of the slides depicting the different religious leaders and how they had moved into hierarchy with time, with the taking into consideration all of the political, all of the population differences that is going to be happening over the next few generations. How do you see the Druze Sheikh al-Aql going? Is it going to be, you're thinking more of a plateau as it is, or do you see a variation in their political powers?
That's a good question. The last couple of decades have been, and this is something I haven't touched upon. The last couple of decades, of course, have been a difficult time, actually, for Sheikh al-Aql. Despite being, in some senses, at its peak now, it has had a difficult relationship with the other leaderships of the community, and particularly, I think, because the politics of the community have been defined partly by the experience of the war, of course, which really gave one faction such weight in politics, and in so many other fields of the community in Lebanon, of course, that it has been much more able to dominate Dar al-Ta'ifa through the Majlis, through the council, through these other kinds of institutions, than has happened in the past. And that is partly simply because one faction in 2006 happened to have all of the seats in parliament, all of the Druze seats in parliament, and were able to pass a new law, a new constitution for the community, which allowed a different kind of domination of these institutions. Whether that will last is difficult to tell. And I think the astonishing thing about these institutions is that they gain kind of a momentum of their own, actually. And I think we've seen this in the Sunni community. Also has been a very much kind of unipolar politically community. And so there's been a lot of control exerted over Dar al-Fatwa in a similar kind of way. And these things go in waves, I think. So the future is difficult to see, but thank you.
Sir, go ahead.
Thank you. What significant differences do you see between the leadership, Druze leadership in Lebanon as compared to Israel and Syria?
A good question, but I'm not an expert on Syria and Israel. I get the impression that that in some of these historical phases, there's been a lot of overlap. And just as you had, we saw the families that controlled these offices for a lot of the 19th and into the 20th centuries in Lebanon. The same thing happened in Syria, as far as I can tell, and I think maybe to some extent in Palestine as well. And except that in Syria, that system has been made more concrete, as far as I know. And so it hasn't developed in the same way. And certainly it hasn't been unified in the same way as in Lebanon. But yes, I mean, that's something to look into. Thank you.
I have a question, which is something controversial. Some people believe that the Druze is a sect of Islam. Some other believe that it's a religion that broke off of Islam. And what kind of effect, I don't know what the view is with my limited knowledge, but what kind of effect does that have politically for the Druze in Lebanon?
A good question. I mean, of course, I'm not a theologian, so it's not for me to judge the answer, where the community falls. But I know that in fact, this is an interesting parallel with Syria. The Sheikhs al-Aql in both Lebanon and Syria have made a huge effort to identify themselves as an Islamic institution. And it's in all of the literature, all kind of official statements. It's always Muslim first. Although increasingly, I'd say there's been a shift towards using the word muwahhideen rather than or as well as Druze, which is, and that's, I think, surprisingly recent in the kind of public presentation of the community to others. And maybe a sign that that some people in these leaderships are becoming more confident about their place in society now. But thank you.
I have a couple of questions for you. One of the slides stated, or it was stated, that al-Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya has been described as the most advanced, progressive, liberal kind of family system. I was wondering, what did the author of that statement mean by that? And my second question would be if you could kindly give us a sort of a preview of what would be the focus of your research for the rest of the year, 2016.
Of course, of course. I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer to the first question. I don't know a lot about the details of personal status law, but I know that. I picked this quote from a legal expert, but I know the law was widely received at the time in the region as being particularly progressive on women's issues. But as for the details, I'm not sure, I'm afraid. I'd have to look it up. As for my research, so the idea of what I'm doing now, as Osama said, is to incorporate a vision of Druze history into a book on religious leadership in Lebanon at large. And so that's really the great, the opportunity of this fellowship is to concentrate on the Druze history for a while, and have it as it should be, given this extraordinary history. I think have it as it should be a pillar in the study of this field.
I thought I saw a hand on the right side.
Anyone else?
Oh, here we go. Zach.
Yeah. In your last graph, you showed there was power. If you can bring up the graph again. Yeah. I was just curious how you measured power. Because there are many ways.
There is no science behind this graph, I should point out. Purely a way of kind of visualizing some of the developments. Yes. Why? Is there something you were thinking of in particular?
I was just wondering if it had to do with like the structures that came into place in the leadership. Maybe that was one way of measuring it. Meaning that the Druze started having more kind of institutions, for leadership and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's kind of largely the way I think of it. It's the consolidation of these institutions allow the figures at the helm to do so much more than they would without them. essentially. It becomes a platform, it becomes a medium of action in society as well. And these religious leaders behave as, kind of talking heads. They're public figures, there to be seen and to speak, but they also have a lot of influence kind of behind the scenes across their communities through these phenomenal institutional networks that are developed. And those vary somewhat from community to community. But we saw, for instance, Sheikh Mohammed Abu Shakra, his building the hospital, orphanage, these kinds of institutions, as well as the fact that Dar Taifa has authority over more or less everything to some extent that goes on in the community in Lebanon. Thank you.
One comment I would like to make is that on the graph you have, it almost makes sense. If you notice that the 1860 and the 1860 where the Ottoman Empire started declining, the sick man syndrome. Mm-hmm. And this is where the French and the Brits started coming into our part of the world. And the Lebanese, and in Lebanon, we got lucky with the French. And the French were more Catholics, and they're more interested with the Maronites. And that's what happened. If you look at there in 1900, this is the power. The Maronites are closely aligned with the French. And this is, I think, if you look at it all the way to 1940, where Lebanon declared its independence, this is where the Maronites started losing more power. And it makes sense what you have there. I don't know if you meant it, but it makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. It's the Maronite patriarch had this kind of fascinating history of playing off the great powers against each other, and they were able to elevate their position tremendously in all kinds of ways, in terms of the region, in terms of Mount Lebanon, even within their own community. And I think that, for me, partly the point of putting that little kind of hump on the first bit of the Maronite line is to say, well, don't assume that the Maronite church was always the preeminent institution in the community. Like all communities, there's change over time, and as you say, the French influence had a huge role. They were able to exploit that, to elevate their position in the empire, in their own community, as against other kinds of power figures in the Maronite community. So you always have this kind of interplay between politics within communities and what's going on outside, and the two are always connected, I find. Thank you.
Okay, we've got two. Ma'am, do we have a microphone?
Yes, hi. First, I was wondering what got you interested in this topic to start with. And the second question I have is regarding the quote that you chose about a space fixed in time and a site of seclusion and introversion, and what you think, or how did your view evolve when you started researching about the Druze history?
The most difficult questions yet, I think. How did I get interested in this? Do
you avail of the ADF fund?
Well, absolutely. On a very basic level, I think Lebanon has a certain addictive quality. But actually, not to mention, of course, the desire to revive the old British Druze connection, perhaps, I don't know. But also, actually, this isn't just a Lebanese story as well. I think Lebanon is a fascinating place to look at because of its uniqueness in the region, and But a lot of these kinds of changes are happening elsewhere across the region at the same time in quite different ways because of the different context. But I think Lebanon offers the opportunity to look at so many of these different dynamics close alongside each other, and to kind of compare between different communities and different traditions and understand a little bit about what makes them tick and why they should be different or similar, essentially. What was your second question? Lost track now. Oh, the quotes. What were my initial thoughts? I'm not sure. I mean, I think I'd already spent enough time talking to sheikhs and priests and kind of religious figures in other communities to realize that what you see on the surface is not always what is going on below. Yes. Anyone else?
Yes, there was a question there, sir. No more question. Any other questions? Yes, we have one question right here. We're getting into
It's just about the methodology of your studies, not about the content. I think you did a great job. I was raised and born in Lebanon and learned a lot today. Where do you get your information from? Do you know how to read and understand Arabic, or this is all what's translated into English? How do you know that your studies are complete, picture of the Druze history?
One never knows. That's why we keep going. Yes, it would be impossible to do this research without reading Arabic. In some ways, this kind of picture can never be complete because we don't have all of the information we'd like to have. There are some great family archives in Lebanon. A lot of wonderful people have preserved all kinds of fascinating things from their families' pasts. But actually, these institutions, until very recently, haven't been good at that. It's taken a long time to develop a culture of, kind of an archival culture, I guess, in these institutions. The Maronite Patriarchate is an exception, but they don't like people looking at their papers. But Dar al-Ta'ifa don't admit to having any archives whatsoever, nor do Dar al-Fatwa in the Sunni community. So sometimes you have to kind of piece things together from chronicles that were written at the time, from all kinds of funny documents that you might not expect to find what you're looking for in, and you start to compile a picture. Yes, that's a partial answer to your question, I think, but.
Is it a short question because we're out of time? Okay, one last question.
Since 2008, there's been a revivalist, some sort of a revival within the community. A lot of people are turning to religion. You clearly differentiated between the formal leadership, religious leadership, and the spiritual leadership. This new revival is within the community is concerning sheikhs who are quite rejectionists. Do you see that as a threat for the community?
Depending how how much momentum it gains, it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. I mean, I think, to be honest, I think it's natural in any community. You have, you end up with kind of different groups that see themselves going in different directions, and you certainly have, there's a lot of rejectionism actually of the official religious leaders in every single community. It doesn't mean they're not there, it doesn't necessarily challenge them that much. it it might challenge these leaders as individuals to respond to these issues, but actually often I think the status of these official religious leaders comes as much from their participation in public life at the higher levels, in kind of the state elite. I'd say it comes more from that kind of activity than from a popular base. We're not really talking about charismatic leaders. I mean, they might happen to be charismatic personalities, but this isn't a charismatic kind of religious leadership that arises out of popular support. It comes from institutions and often legal recognition and these kinds of things. So no, I don't think ultimately it would really threaten Sheikh al-Aql. But if I have a moment, there has been an interesting development, I think, increasingly and it will be interesting to see whether this continues, of the Sheikh al-Aql starting, I think, to see himself as more of a spiritual authority. And even though there is, there is in general this sense of kind of a division of labor, over the decades, and I think we see this with several incumbents. I think back to, I think the Hamadi Sheikhs al-Aql had, they were involved in encouraging much more liberal practices in the majalis. Sheikh Muhammad Abu Shakra is famous partly for trying to change funeral rites, for instance. And of course, perhaps most famously, Sheikh Bahjat Ghaith was positively radical in his religious views, and still sees himself as a potential reformer, and that was his vision for the office. So it's an interesting thing, I think, perhaps through these developments, we might be seeing a new shift back towards the combination of kind of spiritual authority and these kinds of more institutional authority. Whether that will continue, I don't know, but thank you.
Yeah, we're going to thank you. Thank you, everyone. I want to extend a special thank you to the terrific staff of the CCS for coming together again so beautifully and organizing this event. Rania, Tariq, Vicky, Kelly, Susan, and Alyssa. Thank you very, very much. Thank you again, Alex, for such a stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. We're looking forward to the book. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. Safe travels and good night.